Publishing, where we discuss the secrets of Edward Leeds Gallen's Coral Castle and how it pertains to the biblical narrative, DNA, and the floor plan to Solomon's Temple. But today, what we're going to talk about is the chart that I have right here. I mentioned it earlier in an earlier video, but that is it right there. And it's the word letter etymology cross. And I'm also going to get into a hodgepodge of things that I mentioned in other videos, but I really didn't dive into it that deeply. But the word letter etymology is shaped like Jesus' cross. And I didn't think this was going to be very important like it became. But I realized the strangeness of the English language and how certain things are written in the Bible. And most people would say, oh yeah, well it's not important. Not when it comes to the Bible. When it comes to the Bible, every I is dotted and T is crossed. So if you're seeing strange things like all of a sudden they're calling Paul or Saul of Tarsus, Paul. Nobody's ever explained that fully. Okay? And these things would bug me out. You could say, well, you have ADD or whatever these modern illnesses, mental illnesses are. And I say, I'm gonna say something right now. Bullshit. I'm telling you that when something is weird like that in the Bible, you better pay attention because that's an anomaly. So this being in the shape of a cross is no accident. And I realize the M and the W, which is man and woman. It's also right and left, Rachel, Leah, or Ephraim and Manasseh. East and west. I've already covered all this. I'm sorry I'm boring you to death. But these male attribute letters and these female attribute letters, that doesn't get us into patriarchy versus matriarchy. These are alpha male and alpha female. These are beta male and beta female. And notice the X. All the betas are located under the X. And also the J and the Y. The J and the Y represent your groin, okay? And that's always outside the temple. That's Shiva, Kali, evil, Eve, in the sense that she ate the fruit and she handed it to her husband. We're not dumping on women. We're just saying that at that moment, Eve, all of a sudden, her relationship to God changed. And she had to, like Adam, they both had to make their way back to God. And that represents the outer court outside the temple of Solomon. Okay, and this is where the alkali metals and the alkali earth metals are. And that's what alkali is Kali, the god, or we say small g, but I'm not slamming Hinduism, okay? And if you're a Hinduist, that to you may be a capital G, but I'm a Christian and I'm forbidden to do those things. But I'm not knocking anybody's religion. The Hindu religion is very good at describing the same principles that are found in Judaism and Christianity. And everyone's running saying, oh, we got the real God, we got the real God. Let me tell you something. They all get their information from the periodic table, DNA, the zodiac or XY axis, and the alphabet of the language of the people from that area. I don't speak Hindu. I don't speak Chinese. But I'm sure they have a system that lines up essentially the same way. Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, somebody who speaks these languages someday, I hope comes up to me and they say, yes, it is present in Hindi. I said in an earlier video I was going to get into why Jesus' feet being crossed and representing the letter X is very important. And this gets into, in Genesis, I'll eventually quote the place where it happened, but in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. Okay, and that gets into a whole lot of science. That was when the earth went from being the size of a moon to the current size that it is. And all the continental shifts began. Okay? And there's multiple ways in the Bible that this was described. One of them is when you get into Leviathan, it says the scales, no air can come between them. That's plate tectonics. That's describing the earth as having scales like a reptile or a fish, okay, which is what Leviathan represents. Leviathan represents a crocodile, an alligator, lizards, anything reptilian, okay, and behemoth represents most people agree, it's a hippopotamus. And there's variations of that. There's a rhinoceros. And that gets into, in the book of Job, will Mazaroth harrow the fields after you? In other words, will a rhinoceros stick his horn, single horn, in the ground and plow fields for you? That is literally what that's saying. When you look at an old LP record or a modern CD disc, those have rings, concentric rings, and that's what it's saying. It's saying essentially the same thing. These archaic terms carry over into the modern scientific realm. Once you put this together, you realize, wow, the Bible has a very beautiful way of explaining these mathematical, scientific things. And if you raise your children on these biblical accounts, they'll have a lot easier time figuring out difficult concepts in mathematics, because you'll be able to explain it in the form of human clay. I don't want to go off on a tangent. I'll get on my soapbox and I'll stop preaching. But if you get into my graphic with the double image, and these are all for sale, by the way, you can go on my site, snappublishing.com, and purchase these. And I appreciate if you do. It keeps the lights burning around here. But we have a Shopify account, and you can get these graphics relatively cheap. And you can look, as I'm telling you these things, you look at that temple design and you see the 369 is the center line on your body. And I haven't really gotten into that, how that actually works. Now, you think you have 10 fingers, but you actually have 4.5, 4.5. Everything on your body center line is 1 divided by 2. You got 2 nostrils, 1 nose. If you breathe in, it goes into, it's technically 1 lung that has been divided into 2. And you go right down to your groin. Boys have 1 in the center and 2 on each side, and women do too. So this concept is universal in the atom, solar system. And I had an engineer one time say to me, show me in that tree right there this concept. And I said, thank you for saying that, because a tree is an excellent way to define what I'm trying to tell you. A tree is actually a completed circuit. In other words, it's an outie on the leaves and an innie on the roots. So that's a toroid, a torus, or Marco Rodin would call it a poloid. It's poloidal. It's male on the outie. Males are seed spreaders, and females they build the nest. They have the nesting. They're needy. When you see the bird sitting on her eggs, the male has to bring her the worms. They build the nest together. They're building this. Look what a nest is. It's a type of torus. It's a donut. So a tree perfectly explains the 1 and the 0 that you think you have for fingers. The 1 and 0 aren't really numbers per se. The number 1 represents unity. So you could say it's a bounded infinity. And we've already covered this, so I'll just go over it real quick. In other words, the earth is one thing, but it's infinite. You can't number the atoms on earth. Only God could do that. And that's what the number 1 actually represents. And that's why the number 1 is God. It represents God. Okay? It's not God, but it represents God very well. And at one point, before the what we call the Big Bang, when God subdivided into pretty much everything that we see, hear, touch, and feel today. Okay? That event was God subdividing into all matter. Okay, that was known as the original, what do you call it? We call it a magnetic monopole. So a magnetic monopole is something that's always only positive or always only negative. I don't call them positive, negative. I say repulsive or attractive. Okay, so at this point in time, and this goes so far back, nobody knows the origin. This event, who knows what caused it? Okay, a lot of people believe that it was when God had had enough with created beings and said, everyone out. And that was their way of distancing themselves from their creation, just to get some peace and quiet. I respect God's peace and quiet. I don't try to go into the Holy of Holies anymore. I used to press in towards God and I've backed off because I realized, you know what, God deserves to be at peace and at rest. But anyway, if you go on that graphic, the temple graphic, the 3 and 6 and 9, so your 9 is always here and your 6 is always here. And this group, I'll call them 33. I won't mention them by name. It's an esoteric order. And they're claiming, this 3, it's not a bad thing. And I'm like, yeah, it's a real bad thing. Okay, and they're claiming that the 3 is here. You know, the 3 is never here. Okay, the 3 is always your groin. And it's always where it should be, outside the temple, where the sea of brass, the SOB, and the brass altar, where you're supposed to sacrifice, okay, before you enter the holy place. So that 3, or doubling of the 3, that reveals itself several times. And you take any transformer hanging on a pole outside your house, there's a coil here and a coil there, okay? And those coils are the number 3. That's why the 3 looks like a squiggle, okay? The ancients knew this. They understood these concepts. And you say, well, how would they have known that without knowing about electricity? Well, they knew about electricity. I'm here to break the news to you that they understood it. And I'm going to get into, your Egyptologists today, oh, we don't know what obelisks were. They know what obelisks were. Obelisks, they dispersed the static charge that you get in a desert environment. So Pharaoh and the missus, or his harem, they were getting shocked. So were these priests with all these garments that had gold. And they're like, hey, how can we get rid of this static electricity? They built these things that it disperses it, okay? And that's why they have points. And, that's why you have a house or a barn that has a lightning rod and it's always pointy. If you have a surface that's round, you get a totally different effect. Like on ships, they saw St. Elmo's fire. Go into a substation, a modern power substation. They have a lot of aluminum spheres, and that's for a reason. If they did things pointy, they'd be getting hit by lightning more than they do. And you look around those yards, they all have many lightning conductors, right? So these spheres are also another way of dispersing electrical occurrences. Okay, and at night you can actually see what's called St. Elmo's fire, which is a plasma. Okay, and by the way, David is a psalmist. Okay, David is a plasma. That's what psalmist, the what do you call it? Lower, second, and third story of Noah's Ark. In other words, the layering of the onion of what David represents. He was a psalmist. Guess what? That means he's a plasma. His name is David. Okay, I'm not going to go off on a tangent on David, but so you see this 3, 6, and 9. I always say 3, 6, and 9, but it's 9, 6, and 3. And the 6 is always in the center. And then when you see the 5, 6, and 7 on the priestly cells on the outside the building, okay, they're also in the walls of the building, okay, in the form of, niobium, molybdenum, and technetium. The molybdenum technetium would be the 6, and the 3 would be on the inside, which would be the 6. Okay, and this is where people get confused, and they say, "Oh no, the 3 goes into where the 6 is." In fact, when I saw Marco Rodin, I hung out with him many years ago. I had a problem with how he was describing the 6 and the 9 changing places, and I couldn't formulate it back then why we were butting heads. And I also saw this issue in Edward Leeds Gallen's Coral Castle, where he depicts this 3-ton door opposite the 9-ton door. And he's got the Polaris star on this northern point, which it is. Okay, Polaris is the northern point. But how that 9 and 6 interact is very critical. And the people in the ancient world who are trying to defend that Jesus and Lucifer are somehow cleverly the same person, cleverly disguised, they're getting these things purposely jumbled up so people don't have solid in their mind what is actually going on. Okay, and I've, over the past few years, have defined the interaction and the flipping. Now, looking at a modern zodiac, that the 69 is Cancer. Okay, and this gets into, here again, all right? When you start talking about a Mobius strip, that is a figure 8, sideways. That is the infinity symbol, okay? That, if you take that figure 8 sideways, you can get the 6 and the 9 in there, okay? And that is actually in the red up here, okay? The 3 is always below that. But above that, what we call Orion's belt, and the pyramid complex, although it's aligned north to south, it also is east-west, okay? It works both ways. That pyramid complex represents the XY axis, okay? And it represents the repulsive attractive and the east and the west, or I'll get into what that actually is. It's the toil and the spin that Jesus spoke about, okay? And that toil and spin is T, oil, toil, okay? And S, spin, is actually S-P-I-N, which is your S block, P block, that's everything in the periodic order, facing in. When Ezekiel or Isaiah or whoever described God's chariot coming at him, he said the fire was enfolding. That is a description of what I'm telling you. That spin is the enfolding, okay? And that is an attractive description, okay? Jacob saying to a couple of his kids, I will scatter you in Jacob, and I will divide you in Jacob and scatter you in Israel, is another way of saying it. Okay, males scatter the seed, okay, and this is plus, times, or time, times, and then what is subtraction? The dividing of time. Subtraction and division are connected, just like addition and multiplication. So one is a male and the other is a female, okay, and those are polarities, okay? Once you realize, man, these simple things that were described thousands of years ago are pertinent today in modern concepts. So toil and spin, I'm going to get onto that. We'll move on here. Your modern concepts of wormholes, Jesus hanging on the cross represents a wormhole. That is what this WMW is. That's the handmaidens or the midwives, the watchmen I talked about, watchmen, that's them. Midwives, anytime you see an MW in the Bible, that represents this and this, left and right hands. Okay, so your wormwood, there it is. Okay, so like I say, when I first stumbled across this word letter etymology thing, I didn't think it was going to be a big player. I knew it had some significance, but then I arranged it like the temple, okay, down the center, and then having a left and right. And if you were to describe the 9, 6, and 3, the MW would be the iterations of that, which are the priestly cells, which are the 5, 6, and 7, which are essentially the same thing. Okay? But there's your wormwood. And Jesus hanging on the cross representing sin. And this is how those Luciferians got one over on you. This is why they got you wearing crosses. Saying, oh yeah, hey, show this. Because they're saying, yeah, Jesus is the devil. Because God made him sin on that cross. And people wear that, remembering Jesus' sacrifice through that image. That image didn't last long. They took him down, buried him. 3 days later, he rose. If you were a Christian, you believe this. Okay? That was just a brief flash in time. He had 33 years of service before that. And there's that 33 again, right? And by the way, that represents the Old Testament. Jesus came to change and take us from outside the temple to inside the temple. That is where that 3:3 really belongs. Okay? It doesn't belong in where he ended up. Okay? After the death, burial, resurrection. When you were given access to the Solomon's temple, where before only the high priests were allowed in there. Okay? This is the significance of that. And these people that are 33, they're like, oh, see that? You know, Jesus 33, Jesus Lucifer. No. That is in the old system. We're in a new system now. You didn't get the memo, evidently, because now you're dealing with the 6 and the 9. And people are running around saying, oh, geez, we're looking for the beast, 666. Don't bother, because that's just the mark of a man. Any man. All men and women and children. The beast you need to be worrying about is the 333. Okay? And someday it's all going to change. It's like I say, the next iteration is fluorine. It's 9. I don't want to get off on that though, but I just wanted to go over the wormwood aspect of it and how Jesus is actually a wormhole. Okay, he represents the same thing as Asclepius or whatever that Greek symbol is, where they held the pole up with the snake on it, or the cross with the snake around it, Asclepius, and the other one. That's where this whole idea behind that. And people say, oh, the Greeks believed in false gods. You know, they understood things the same way. But anyway, I don't want to get off on the Greek legends versus Christianity. It's just another way to reinforce these lessons when you're trying to explain things to people. And every tool you have, you should use every tool in your toolbox. Don't discard something because somebody said, oh, the Greeks, they worshipped, they were pagans and they worshipped false gods. Hey, time out. I'll stop. That is true. But you can still learn from that stuff. That's why I superimposed Jacob's children over the Greek zodiac. And it was a perfect match. Once I realized I had to double up 2 of the boys, and Virgo it was Dinah. But anyway, we already talked about that. Okay, so thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And check out our link down below. And have a nice day.